Content warning. This episode contains discussion of the murder of 2 girls, grooming, child sexual abuse materials, and other crimes against children.
We've done a few episodes interviewing former partners of individuals who turned out to be sexual predators. Today, we're going to hear from another woman who found herself in that very position several years ago. We have been in touch with a former girlfriend of Kegan Kline.
As a quick recap, Kegan is an inmate incarcerated in Miami County Jail. He recently pled guilty to a litany of charges around child sexual abuse materials. Police publicly linked his Anthony Shots social media accounts to the Delphi murders back in December 2021. Our reporting revealed the extent of that link when we published transcripts that showed law enforcement personnel interrogating Kline about being in touch with Liberty German before her death. The lead centering around Kline was a major thrust of the investigation into the Delphi murders for several years, although the arrest of Richard Allen leaves the status of that angle rather murky. Still, given that we know investigators were strongly interested in Kegan Kline, and given that we also feel it's important to expose crimes against children, we remain interested in this story.
Well, we recently heard from a young woman who was previously in a relationship with Kegan. This episode will take the form of an interview with her about her life with Kegan. Before we get started, let's take a moment to remember that Kegan Kline has a history of dishonesty. We believe that he in fact told these various things to his former girlfriend, but it's a step too far to assume everything he says is true. For instance, his former girlfriend told us that he claimed to have a brain tumor. We believe that he told her that. We don't have access to his medical records or any insight that he's being treated for a brain tumor. So we're not going to necessarily assume that he does have or did have a brain tumor. We don't feel it's fair to Kegan Kline to completely rule it out, but we would encourage everyone to maintain an air of healthy skepticism.
You will also hear that Kegan made some specific claims regarding his father, Tony Kline. Keep in mind what we've just said. We do believe that Kegan Kline said these things to his girlfriend, but that does not mean that they are true. And in regard to the claims against Tony Kline, please listen to the end of the program where we will have more information regarding them. We won't use the former girlfriend's name, and we're not going to use her voice. I'm going to read out the questions we asked her, and Anya will read the woman's responses. We respect her privacy. She's given us the okay to read out her words, though. She wants to share her story with the public.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, The Murdersheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murdersheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're the Murdersheet.
And this is The Delphi Murders, a conversation with Kegan Kline's former girlfriend.
As a reminder, to protect the privacy of Kegan's former girlfriend, I will be reading the questions we asked her and Anya will be reading the replies. How did you meet Kegan Kline? Could you give us a timeline of your relationship, approximately when you met, when you cut off contact, and any other important approximate dates?
He approached me on Snapchat when I was 16 as himself. He told me he was living in Vegas, sent me pics of his apartment. A couple of years later, 2-ish months after I turned 18, he texted me again. I can't remember what all was said, but we ended up setting up a time to meet and hang out. We first met in person at his mom's house about a week or two into May 2019. We started dating on May 23rd, 2019.
What was your relationship with Kegan?
I was his girlfriend when he got arrested at my apartment.
How would you describe his surface-level personality? That is, the personality he initially showed to you and to the world.
The personality he initially showed to me was goofy, caring, funny, soft, intelligent. Around his friends, he just kind of acted like guys do with each other, if that makes sense. When he did have friends over, he insisted I come out there and sit. He always mentioned how his friends never saw him with a girlfriend. It always made me feel weird. I felt like an accessory. To other people, he seemed kind and likable.
Where was Kegan living during your relationship?
I started staying with him at his mom's. Then we moved into my parents' house, and then we moved into my apartment in Kokomo. The majority of the time we were together was in my apartment. I'm not sure of exactly how long we were living at my or his mom's.
What did he do for work?
He worked at a hog farm when we first got together. He also told me he was a freelancer on the app Fiverr doing graphic design. One company he claimed to have a gig for was Target. Once we moved to Kokomo, he didn't work at all. He told me he still did freelancing work on Fiverr, but he was using the money for his school loans. I believed that then.
Did Kegan ever talk to you about the Delphi case in a casual manner? Like, wow, did you see that on the news?
I can remember one time when he did bring the Delphi case up. He was just saying how terrible it is, and then said something like, "Isn't it crazy how that guy could be walking around and no one would ever know it's him?"
What did Kegan tell you about prior romantic relationships?
He was always ex-blaming. How they all cheated on him, would talk down on them.
How did Kegan treat you?
He treated me really good at first. Once things got comfortable, he started abusing me emotionally, calling me all kinds of names, telling me I'm worthless. He always made sure to do the love bombing afterwards, with promises to change. This cycle happened every time we had a fight. Some fights were over me doing things a different way than what he wanted or would normally do. A lot of fights happened because I kept thinking he was cheating on me. I wasn't allowed to touch his phone ever. And if I did for whatever reason, he was right there watching me. I started to make a deal out of that. And if I questioned it to the point of an argument, he somehow always turned it around on me and would accuse me of cheating. He is very manipulative and really knows how to gaslight and make you feel like you're going crazy. He used to tell me I should be in a psych hospital. It got to a point of me questioning who I was and feeling like I'd rather just die because I felt like I could never leave. He is the true definition of a narcissist.
What did your friends think of Kegan?
My friends really weren't around much. He had me convinced that my best friend was a bad influence on me, and that made me limit contact with her.
What did your family think of Kegan?
My family didn't like him because he was very distant with them. Kegan didn't like if I was gone too long visiting them.
When did you first wonder if there was something unusual about Kegan Kline?
While he was sleeping, I found a hidden app on his phone called Dropbox. I got into it and immediately recognized a female friend that he would regularly talk to. It was a high-tension moment for me, because I was worried that he would wake up and catch me on his phone. I was in shock and didn't know what to do. I deleted the app and went back to sleep. He woke me up yelling at me, telling me I deleted very important work files for one of the jobs he was working on for Fiverr. When I told him I saw nude images, he got mad and said it was just pictures from his past that he hadn't deleted yet. He was upset with me for days over this, despite how I felt, thinking he really was cheating on me. Fast forward to speaking with detectives after his arrest in 2020, I was made aware this Dropbox app was used to store a lot of his child pornographic material. It still affects me to think about that incident. Makes me sick to my stomach to think I was so close to witnessing such horrific things.
Did Kegan Kline ever talk about his childhood and adolescence? If so, what did he say?
I think he told me he was living out of his car at 15 at one point. He mentioned a time his dad pointed a shotgun at his mom, him, and his siblings. I can't remember a whole lot on that topic.
Did you ever meet Kegan's father, Tony? If so, what was he like?
Yes, a couple times. He was nice from my perception. Could see him having a wild personality.
What was Kegan's relationship like with his father?
They seemed fairly close. I do know Kegan enjoyed his money.
Did Kegan Kline ever receive money from his father?
Yes, he did.
Did you meet Kegan's mom or half-siblings?
Yes and yes.
Did you get a sense of Kegan's relationship with his mom and half-siblings?
It all seemed quite normal, but I didn't see them much.
Did you ever meet Kegan's maternal or paternal grandparents? If so, what were they like?
I met his paternal grandparents a couple of times. They seemed like nice people.
What do you know about Kegan Kline's February 2017 visit to Las Vegas with his father?
Only that they went there together.
What can you tell us about Kegan Kline's electronics? Did he have an unusual number of devices? Or did everything seem pretty normal?
Everything seemed pretty normal. What I can remember is he had a phone, Xbox, and a computer he had bought for PC gaming.
Was Kegan protective of his technology, his phones, tablets, computers, other devices, while he was around others?
Only his phone, if I remember right. Granted, I had no interest in playing Xbox or using the computer anyway because it was slow.
Did Kegan Kline have normal social media profiles?
I know he had a Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat, all in his name.
Did he have any hobbies, interests? We're interested in getting to know the person he presented as on the surface, before his crimes were revealed.
He liked the Howard Stern show, Joe Rogan's podcast, Xbox gaming. He liked animals, documentaries, DVDs, cooking, smoking weed.
What do you know about Kegan's musical career and ambitions?
I know he would record songs and then make it sound nothing like him. He wanted to be famous.
Could Kegan Kline drive? Did he own a car? If not, then how did he get around?
He could, but no license. He didn't own a car. He rarely would ever leave the house. I would drive. At one point, his dad lended us a car to use, and I sold mine.
Did Kegan Kline have physical health issues, such as seizures?
He claimed he had seizures along with a brain tumor. I never witnessed any.
Kegan now claims to be schizophrenic and bipolar. Did you see signs of that or any other mental illnesses he might have?
Schizophrenia? Absolutely not. He was completely coherent and never showed a symptom for schizophrenia. I believe he is a narcissist.
Did Kegan Kline drink alcohol?
No.
Did Kegan Kline do drugs?
Marijuana.
Is there anything about Kegan that seemed minor at the time, but strikes you differently in hindsight?
He mentioned he preferred smaller or skinnier bodies. I didn't think anything of it at the time.
Was he ever violent in front of you?
No.
Was he ever physically threatening or abusive towards you?
No.
Was he psychologically or emotionally abusive?
Very much so.
Did he own or have access to any weapons?
He had a gun. I gave it to the detectives.
What lies did Kegan tell you?
That he's been to college, had a brain tumor, suffered seizures. He told me he helped write songs for different bands when he was 15 or so. Claimed to have a cousin in the band, The Traditional.
What do you know about Kegan Kline's relationship with his Vegas roommate?
I was told he was his dad's neighbor in Peru, and then later his roommate. Kegan told me that his Vegas roommate stole all of his things, let the apartment they shared in Vegas get evicted, and left. I don't know how true that is.
What do you know about Kegan Kline's relationship with friend number 2?
Friend number 2 is his old friend from school, I think. It was a marijuana-related relationship.
Did Kegan ever frequent any locations like bars, stores, or parks?
No, he was in the apartment a majority of the time.
Do you happen to know anything about where Kegan Kline was on February 13th, 2017?
I have no idea. I didn't know him at that time.
Did Kegan have any sort of familiarity with Delphi, Indiana?
I'd assume so. He seemed to know directions to different towns well.
How did you hear about the February 25th, 2017 FBI raid on his father's house in Peru?
Initially, Kegan told me about it, saying he got raided for marijuana. He also told me they didn't find anything because he stashed it all in the microwave. I didn't learn the real reason for the raid until detectives questioned me after his arrest in 2020.
What do you know about what happened with that raid and Kegan's questioning afterwards?
I heard that he failed a polygraph.
Did Kegan ever talk to you about the Delphi case or the fact that the police were investigating him for it?
No, he never disclosed that to me.
How did you hear about his August 2020 arrest?
The SWAT team and Indiana State Police kicked open my apartment door and announced themselves with guns drawn.
Do you know any details about where or when exactly he was arrested and how that all went down?
I think it was sometime in the afternoonish in my apartment. They escorted me out first and walked him out in handcuffs. They wanted to question me then, but I refused because they wouldn't tell me what they were arresting him for. I was in shock and really confused.
Do you know or have a guess about why police delayed arresting him until 2020?
My guess is to try and build more evidence on him.
How did you find out about the nature of his crimes?
I called the jail and they read his charges off to me.
Were you interviewed by law enforcement about his child sexual abuse materials crimes?
Yes.
Were you interviewed by law enforcement about the Delphi murders? If so, how did that go?
I can't remember good details because so much was being thrown at me at once. They presented the Anthony Shots profile and pictures of cars and just asked me if I had known about the account. That was the first time I had ever heard of it. I answered their questions the best I could.
Do you know if there's any connection between Kegan and other Delphi persons of interest / suspects, such as Ron Logan or Rick Allen?
No clue. I only heard about them when they came up in the media.
Do you feel Kegan groomed you?
Absolutely. I'm now 22 and have come to terms with a lot.
How has this relationship impacted your life?
I don't trust anymore. It's hard for me to open up and be friends with anyone. I only trust my close family and fiancé.
Do you think Kegan could be linked to the Delphi murders?
Definitely. You can't tell me that he was texting one of the girls to meet on the bridge the day before the murders occurred, and he knows nothing about it? It doesn't add up.
What does the public need to know about Kegan Kline?
He's a sad, disgusting excuse for a person. Very manipulative and apathetic.
What do you feel would be an appropriate punishment for Kegan for what he's admitted to and what he's done?
Death penalty. Pedophiles need to be put down. You cannot change people like him.
Who is the real Kegan Kline?
I have no idea. I only got a glimpse into who he really is. I can't even imagine.
We want to thank Kegan's former romantic partner for stepping forward and sharing her story with us. We know it wasn't easy, but we feel strongly that her speaking about this traumatic experience is helpful and instructive to others dealing with similar situations. As we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we trust what Kegan's former romantic partner told us. In other words, we believe that he told her the things she reports that he told her. But that doesn't mean that what Kegan told her was true. In fact, we all know that Kegan Kline has a propensity for lying. At one point during the interview, of course, Kegan's former girlfriend mentioned that Kegan told her a specific thing about Tony Kline. Our reaction to that was that we'd really like to get Tony Kline's side of the story, given that Kegan has at the very least a serious credibility problem.
In a previous interview that we did with Tony's former stepdaughter, she mentioned that he had shot her with a BB gun. But of course, Kegan's claim to his ex-girlfriend was that Tony had pointed a rifle at the whole family. In an effort to get both sides of the story out there, we reached out to another person covering the Delphi case who's developed a personal relationship with Tony Kline.
Rick Snay runs the Delphi After Dark channel, which you can find on YouTube.
Can you give a quick description of, the work you've been doing in the Delphi case space over time?
basically, since the arrest of Richard Allen, I've been looking into the possibility that there were others involved. I got into the case because a really good friend of mine in school is actually Libby's mother's aunt. Her brother was Libby's father, or Carrie's father. So that's how I got into it, because I was talking to her one day and she happened to mention her relationship to it. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that I knew somebody that close that was affected by it. So I started out by making videos in the beginning because I was kind of upset with some things that were going on in Reddit at the time. And people started listening to it, and watching my show and everything. And before I knew it, I had, 1,000 subscribers. So I suddenly was a YouTube content creator, and I've kind of stuck with it.
Can you tell us how you've come to know Tony Kline?
So Tony apparently, he worked with a friend of mine that I used to work with years ago. I haven't spoken to him for probably 20 years, but I knew his name. And I noticed that Tony had on Facebook, he had this person on his friends list, and it was a common friend between the two of us. So I thought, what the heck, I'll give it a shot. And I sent him a text. And at the time, I was probably one of the only people on the face of the earth that thought he had nothing to do with the Delphi. And I told him that I didn't think that, he was a killer or anything like that, and that I was sorry that he was going through everything he was going through. And I didn't expect to hear from him, but I did. He sent a message back, and, he told me, this is crazy. I've given DNA. I've taken a lie detector, taken a polygraph and everything. My dog's giving DNA, and I'm still dealing with this. So I didn't hear anything from him for a few months, but apparently he was listening to or watching my channel. And he heard me say that I was going to be at Kegan's hearing, which actually is where we met each other. And he said, he called me and he said, hey, actually he messaged me and said, could you give me a call? He gave me his number on Facebook. So I called him, and he had me meeting him in Kokomo. And we sat in his car and talked for about an hour or so. And we've been talking back and forth ever since.
Absolutely. And in this case, we're talking about, we did sort of an interview with a woman who was romantically linked with Kegan, Tony's son, and she mentioned that she thought Tony seemed like a nice guy, but that Kegan had also told her stories about Tony pointing a shotgun at Kegan and the rest of his family. And we wanted to kind of...
Did you have a chance to ask Tony about that claim?
Yeah, I talked to him about that. He's actually in the hospital right now, and he was in a lot of pain and on some pain medication. So he was kind of emotional, but he was present, and he knew what he was talking about. I told him that, and I kind of already knew what his answer was going to be, because we've talked about Kegan a lot. And Kegan was Tony's best friend, I think, as well as his son. He told me that everybody that knew him knew that whatever Kegan wanted, Kegan got. Tony was a single adult, and he had a great job. He was making a lot of money, owned his house, didn't have a lot of bills to pay and everything. So he was giving Kegan money, just giving it to him. And, so he had everything he wanted growing up. He had the newest, phones and equipment and computers and stuff. He had Jordans, the newest Jordans and so forth. So he was a very spoiled child. As far as pointing a shotgun at him and his family, Tony told me he can't remember ever having pointed any kind of a gun at anybody. So he doesn't, he what do you call refutes?
Yeah.
He refutes that story as far as, thinking it was probably just something that Kegan came up with.
And certainly Kegan has a history of making things up, of lying and blaming others.
You mentioned the spoiling Kegan aspect. The only other thing that our source, who is romantically involved with Kegan, mentioned was just that Tony gave Kegan money, which of course parents do for kids sometimes, especially when they're young and starting out. And does that sound like perhaps that would be more of an accurate statement on Kegan's part, or does that make you skeptical too?
Well, I know Tony was still giving Kegan money up till right before his arrest in 2020. Tony was sending Kegan money while he was in Vegas, because he would write and say, or call or whatever, text and say, "Hey Dad, I'm having a little trouble, kind of behind right now, could use a little money," and Tony would send it to him. So, he was supporting him financially right up until his arrest.
Right. And then I guess just one other question, just kind of going towards Tony's emotional state over this. You mentioned him being emotional about this. I know that he's sort of contending that Kegan has told many lies about him. And I guess, how is he feeling about that at this point, given that it's not really, obviously, innocuous white lies? These are pretty serious accusations, and sort of
right.
How has that affected him?
He was actually, he broke down yesterday. He was in tears when we talked about this, because he's bothered mostly by the fact that he feels like Kegan was trying to throw him under the bus. And he's very hurt by it. I think there's also some anger there, of course, and he hasn't spoken with him. One thing I did find out from the conversation yesterday, the last time he spoke with Kegan was before the river search. And then once the rumors came out about the red Jeep and everything, and it was supposedly came straight from Kegan, Tony he said he was done at that point, and he hasn't spoken to him since. He hasn't sent him money. Kegan has called a few times at the house, and Tony will not accept the charges. And as of last week, I think, he is now blocked. So even when he calls, it says the caller's not available. Mm-hmm. So he's hurt. Obviously hurt, and he is also angry. But beyond that, he's disgusted with the charges. He can't believe what he's reading in the charges itself.
Has Tony ever expressed an opinion to you about what sort of sentence would be appropriate for Kegan?
Well, Tony has said to me, his opinion is that if he had anything at all to do with Delphi, then he wanted him to get the death penalty. But, I don't think he believes he had anything to do with Delphi, But as of right now, he said when we were talking yesterday, he said something about he's thinking it's probably going to be 40 do 20 type situation. They're going to give him 40 years. He'll have to do 20 of it, get time served. But he thinks that he should be, honestly, he thinks because of the nature of the crimes, because they involve kids, he thinks he ought to be in jail with no chance of parole for the rest of his life. So that may be a little harsh,
If Kegan is sort of knowingly throwing his father under the bus, knowing that he's not involved, does Tony, do you get the sense he has any thoughts about why that he would do this? Because it does sound like, from what you're saying, that they were close for many years. So I imagine that's a pretty baffling situation to be in, but does he have any sort of thoughts on why something like that would happen?
He has absolutely no clue. He is totally confused. I've told him that it's more than likely, to me, I've studied a lot of psychology, and I've told him that I think Kegan has histrionic personality disorder. And when you have that, you just come up with these stories, and you just tell people stories that you think they want to hear to make yourself look more important or, more popular or whatever. And I tried to explain it to him that way, but he has just told me time and time again, he's just totally confused. It just blindsided him. He can't understand where it came from.
That kind of covers all our questions, Rick. Is there anything that we didn't ask you about that you think it's important for our audience to hear?
I guess Tony himself has told me that he's given DNA twice and taken two lie detectors, or at least taken at least one polygraph exam. So he told me he's taken at least one polygraph exam and given DNA twice. And, he has never been told by anyone in any kind of authority that he is any kind of focus of this investigation. And they also never got a hold of him after they put his name on that witness list. His name was on Kegan's witness list, and they never approached him, never told him, this is what we want you to testify to, anything like that. So he has no idea why his name was on the list.
That was interesting to me in that it seemed like relatively shortly after that, it was all over. There's no trial anymore.
Right.
And
right.
I kind of looked at that as possibly being the reason, although I can't know that for certain because we're not behind the scenes lurking in conference rooms overhearing people. We're just, we're kind of watching from the outside. But I think that struck me as interesting that some of the people in Kegan's life are sort of named and all these investigators are named. And then suddenly this, his lack of, his interest in the trial seems to suddenly fall away.
I think on some level, there has been a long, gradual buildup toward him taking a plea. Because if you look at the way his case progressed, they kept talking about, there was one point where his lawyers said, there are negotiations in process. And of course that has to be negotiations toward, taking some form of plea. So I kind of tend to lean to, he was probably considering a plea all along, but yeah, I do think that when he saw that the trial was coming up and it became real, and he saw these names on the list, yeah, I think then he might have kind of second thought the process of sitting through a trial and having people testify against him.
We'd like to thank Rick Snay for sharing his perspective with us this week. And again, we'd like to thank Kegan's former girlfriend for sharing her story with us. Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening.